So this first part of the class, we're going to look at the methods of archaeology, how archaeologists actually do their work, how they know what they know about the past. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of some of the work I did in Turkey at a site you can see here right on the Tigris River. So this is looking from the site towards the Tigris. As I said before, this is part of ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia was the land between Euphrates and the Tigris, where the earliest cities and the earliest civilizations arose. And we're going to learn about Mesopotamia again in a couple of weeks. Site, very long name. You can see, you won't have to know that. It's right on the bend in the Tigris River, and you can see this city right nearby, Batman. There actually is a city called Batman, no relation to the superhero. And that picture I showed you is looking from the site towards the Tigris. Well, what did we find at this site? This site was about 4,000 years old. When we excavated it, we found a number of different buildings. I'm going to show you a little bit more of that. But one of the things that you find commonly in a lot of archaeological sites, especially archaeological sites that are maybe 7,000 from 7,000 BC or younger, is lots and lots of pottery. You find tons and tons of pottery. Before about 8,000 BC or 9,000 BC was the time before pottery was invented in many areas of the world. But once people had pottery, you find tons of it in archaeological sites from those time periods. Now, why is that? Well, you have to think about what is being made and what it's being made from. Pottery is fired ceramic, fired clay. It's a artificial substance. It's a human created substance. If you take a piece of clay, you make it into the shape of a pot and you let it dry in the sun, and then later on you put some water in it, it's going to absorb all the water again. It's just going to turn into a big lump of clay. When you fire it, it becomes impervious to water, doesn't lose its shape. It's pretty much almost indestructible, except that pottery breaks, right? So the shapes, the vessels will break, but the substance they're made from is pretty much indestructible. And those are really the two reasons why you find a lot of pottery in archaeological sites. It was very useful to people. When it broke, they had to make more. They threw out the broken pottery, but the stuff that the pottery was made from didn't degrade or decompose over time. It just accumulated in the archaeological site. And you can see there's a lot you can learn from pottery. This is one of the things we'll talk about in class, but you can see there are different shapes. Different shapes are used for different purposes. Some shapes, like this one, are good for cooking. Some shapes are good for serving food. Some shapes are good for storing liquid. All of these different shapes had different functions, so you could tell what people use them for. Also, the style of the pottery can tell you a little bit about what time period the pottery is from. If you study an area extensively and you learn about the pottery, you can then, when you find pottery from a different site, you will be able to actually date that archaeological site. Okay, so we found a lot of stone structures up here on this site. So here's the site that we worked on in Turkey. You don't have a lot of, in many sites in the Middle East, you don't have like perfectly well-preserved buildings like you see in, the Egyptian temples. You have basically the foundations of the buildings with the walls collapsed and gone, and you have the stuff that was left on the floor. That's mainly what you have. Well, what are the things that we found? Well, one area of the site was kind of interesting. We found a lot of these artifacts you can see over here. This is a comparison from a different site, but you can see they're made out of clay. There's a sort of humanoid figure, some sort of little cup here for liquid. They're highly decorated. The joke in archaeology is if you don't know what something is used for, you say religious or ritual purposes. And that's kind of a running joke in archaeology, where they find an artifact, not exactly sure what it's used for, they say, oh, it must have been ritual. In this case, this is probably true for these artifacts. You can see that there's not really any other use that you would have from these art objects other than some sort of ritual religious purpose. Okay, well, this archaeological site, I was lucky to take some Grand Valley students over several years. Some of them have gone on to careers in archaeology. This is in Istanbul before we actually went to the site. But when you go and you look around that area where we worked and you drive around other parts of the Middle East, archaeological sites are actually very noticeable, right? You'll see this mound over here. This is what's known as a tell. Right? A tell is the Arabic word for mound. But this mound that you see over here is not natural. It's a human-created mound over centuries. Right? The way these tells form is something that you can observe in, let's say, a village today in the Middle East. So this is where we lived in Turkey. Most of the people here use mud brick to make their homes. Why mud brick? Well, you can see there's not a lot of trees anymore. There's a lot of earth. There's a lot of mud. It's relatively dry, so it's kind of an adobe kind of architecture. It makes a lot of sense in this area of the world. Now, mud brick is good, but it doesn't last forever. So if you make a house, eventually it will start to collapse if you don't repair it. And you can see here in the same village that we worked in, this is a house you can see that has collapsed and people moved sort of next to it. Now, what do you use a abandoned building where the roof is gone? What do you use it for? Well, garbage. People would throw their garbage in there. The garbage accumulates, piles up, and then they would build right on top of the debris of that earlier house. And they kept doing this year after year, year after year. Over 100 years or 1,000 years, you end up getting a mound. So this is the modern village that we lived in, and they had just moved off of the tell. But for thousands of years, people have lived in the same spot, and their buildings and trash accumulated on top of each other, one layer after the other, until you get a mound that could be 100, 150, maybe 200 feet high. Right? So tells are pretty noticeable in the Middle East. They're not natural. They're human occupation mounds, and sometimes they're useful for actually finding sites. So a lot of these ancient cities in the Middle East, like some of the sites we're going to talk about, like Jericho, or the ancient city of Uruk in Mesopotamia, they are all tell sites. Okay, one Grand Valley student, you can see I brought him to the site, and he was able to, you can see, excavate a burial of, this is like a teenage girl. You can see her bronze earrings over here. We're going to talk about different kinds of context and excavation. You get a little bit of a sense of the excavation here. As you dig into a tell, right, so here's the tell. As you dig into it, you're revealing the layers of history, one piled on top of the other. Right? You can get a little sense here. As they're excavating, they're careful to keep all of the artifacts from one area separate from artifacts from another area. We're going to talk more about that. But here you can see those layers within the tell. So originally the tell stretched all the way over here. We've dug maybe, I don't know, 6 feet down, and we've uncovered some buildings and things like that. Archaeology is a very careful science, so you have to keep records of everything. And once you've dug into a tell, you can then see the layers of history. And this is known as stratigraphy. It's the same thing in geology, but these different strata are piled one on top of the other. We'll talk a little bit more about stratigraphy in just a little bit. Right, so here's the remains of the site. Of course, at the site you also have conservation work that needs to be done. This includes reconstruction of vessels and things like that. But you also get to live with other peoples. This was, really one of the rewarding parts of working in Turkey in another country, is you get to live with people of a different culture, get to learn about their culture. As these two Grand Valley students you can see hanging out with some of the Kurdish guys who were working at the site. The Tigris area that we were working on is being flooded because of a hydroelectric dam that's being built on there. And when I took students previously, we actually took a little tour of some of the sites that were threatened to be flooded. And you can see that it was so hot in this area of Turkey that the road, the asphalt, got so hot that the treads of the tire stuck to the road and completely got torn off. So this is a really interesting area of Turkey, and in the past few years I've expanded my research to include the Great Lakes and the use of underwater robots to explore shipwrecks in the Great Lakes and other inland lakes. And this is a little bit of a capture from one of the robots that was exploring a shipwreck that was actually built originally in 1850 on an area of Grand Valley State's campus today. The area right by the river that's owned by Grand Valley, where the crew team practices, was originally a shipbuilding area, and this ship was built there long before, 110 years before Grand Valley actually became a university. Okay, in the next video we're going to launch right into how archaeology works and a little bit of the methods.